So about me, that's me, David Von Thenen. So cloud native engineer at VMware. Twitter, GitHub, just first initial, last name. Active Kubernetes member. Participate in the VMware user group. Also in SIG cloud provider. Kind of some jokes over there. I obviously CI/CD. I'm also constantly trying to replace myself with automation, right? Like I don't want to keep repeating and doing the same thing over and over again. Test, tinker, test, fail, repeat. That's kind of like almost the definition of like CI stuff, right? And then a lot of the stuff that I do is it's in cloud, right? So it's using like AWS, Azure, and on-prem with VMware, but it's cloudy is all day, right? So the agenda. So I'm going to talk about like the beginnings, like kind of frame like what the problem is that my team faced, and then we're going to, kind of like talk about the project a little bit briefly, like the project that I work on. And it's really not about my project, it's actually about everyone else's projects, like the tools that we used in order to get our project off the ground, right? And then I get this question a lot. So like, how do you balance product versus project? So like how do you like make money off it? Because money is good because it pays my salary, right? But at the same time, you have to like talk about open source and like how you need to kind of put that at the forefront, right? Because everything's open source these days. And then I'm going to kind of talk about like what I learned in the process. And then hopefully I'll have enough time for like some Q&A at the end. And like kind of leave it open for questions. So let's get started. The origin story, right? Like the Marvel comics and stuff like that. So the project that I work on is called Tanzu Community Edition, and it initially started as a closed product, right, within VMware. And what the company decided to do was take this product and turn it to open source, right, and make it available for the community, have like a community supported thing that's out there, right? And what Tanzu Community Edition actually does is provides a way for you to like bootstrap and launch and create Kubernetes clusters, whether they're managed or like whether they're managed or unmanaged. If you want to like have like a little like playground for you to like try and like use your Kubernetes clusters, like deploy apps and stuff like that, or if you want to deploy some sort of like production kind of a thing. So that's what TCE does. And what we ended up doing was we took that product, we took all of the source code, and we ended up creating two repos actually. And the first repo was like a framework. And so it's like there's an open framework, it's called Tanzu Framework. And what that actually does, it provides you a framework for other people to create other Kubernetes distributions, but like in a kind of a VMware prescribed way of doing things. And the project that I work on is this other one. It's called Tanzu Community Edition. And it takes that framework, does all of the wrapping, like how do we install, how do we build, and then how do we like test, and how do we like create the pipelines and everything so that we can deliver this open source edition to the end users out in the community. So we took that, this closed source thing, and when you move it from like behind the firewall to outside in the public, there's a lot of things that you have to change, like internal tools, like what your CI system looks like, the processes even, because you have on the closed side, you have product managers that are telling you, you need to do X, Y, and Z, right, to make money off this. But in open source, it's very different. Like it doesn't work like that, right? And so all that kind of like accumulates to like, how do you get features? Like how do you like get features and feedback from the community? So the idea is like take this closed thing and make it an open source project. So you might be wondering like, hey, does this really, so that's kind of like our story, right? And like, does this apply to you, like the people in the room here? And I think it does. And it covers kind of unique situation. But if you have like a project that you're looking to like, start from the ground up, like in greenfield situation, kind of ignore the history that I have right here. And you can take some of the learnings here and like hopefully apply it to your project. But for those people that are taking something that may have been like a product or even a project that was internal and you're looking to make it external, this is kind of like the flow that we went through in order to like make that happen. So let's explore the tools. So like I said, we came from a product and we open sourced everything. And I think this picture beautifully captures like what we had to go through, right? We had legacy code, like a crap ton of it, pardon my French. And that kind of represents that big clock that probably doesn't work anymore, right? And we needed to migrate something towards like open source, right? And I think that represents that little clock, this thing that we wanted to like kind of pare down and like, this is the core set of functionality, and have this little clock be like the representation of like what the open source stuff was. Kind of abandon the larger clock, but at the same time, you're kind of like tied to it, right? And so I kind of like this picture. Kind of funny too, but it's all good. So that's kind of where we started. And we had our initial stuff, all of our CI/CD pipelines downstream or behind the firewall. We were using Jenkins, and we had a whole bunch of Jenkins, groovy stuff that were defining all of our pipelines and stuff like that. And server stood the thing up in AWS, bring all over the pipelines that we had created downstream, like open source them, and then call it a day. But I think that's not quite like the open sourcey way of doing things, right? Like if you're going to build a project in the open, you kind of like want to have all of your tools and your like automation and all that stuff kind of like tailored specifically towards the open source community. So what we did was we kind of like just said, we actually did look at it and said, hey, like let's try this out. And what we decided was like, no, let's not do that. That's not like kind of the way we wanted to do things. And so we started exploring different CI systems that are up there. I threw some logos on from like the things that we kind of did explore. Circle CI, we obviously did, looked at Jenkins, we looked at Tecton and like GitHub and GitHub Actions. And as we were evaluating all these different pieces of software, like these were the problems and issues that we ran into. We obviously like evaluated like the open source or the free version of it first, because that's kind of like where you start. You don't want to like start paying money for like this piece of software or whatever, and then you're like, oh no, this is not going to work for us kind of a thing. So these are kind of like all the problems that we ran into. I'm only going to highlight a couple of them that was really particular, like pertain to our situation. But I think they probably cover a lot of other people's use cases as well. So the obvious ones are like, hey, there are some CI systems where you'd run your, you have a PR, you want to make sure that the PR is good before checking it in, so it'd kick off CI. And so one of the immediate ones that like stick out in my mind are like there were some CI systems that had like 200 concurrency limits, which sounds like that's a lot. Like I'm 200 jobs at once. Like usually that would cover like most people's situations. But if you think about it, in the case that we ran into, like every PR that was open and every commit that you pushed, that what we wanted to do is like, hey, we're going to stand up an entire new environment for this commit and then like test it all the way through. And then if you have someone, like myself, who's like, I'm going to push this commit like really, really fast. And then you have multiple people on the team doing it, like, 10, 20, 30. You can burn through those 200 concurrent limit like really fast. And then the other one was a lot of the CI systems had like maximum time, like job lengths of 50 minutes, which sounds like a lot. But when we were doing our initial end-to-end tests, when we were kicking off, like doing a PR and like commit to main, and then we want to kick off all of our end-to-end tests, when you first start out, you basically you do the stupid thing. Like we did the stupid thing. Most people do it. We just want it to work first, right? Kick off all the end-to-end tests, run them all in series, right? One right after the other. And you can easily see if you're gonna like hit AWS, if you're gonna hit Azure, if you're gonna hit like your local stuff like vSphere, and you do them sequentially one after the other, you can burn through that 50 minutes quite fast, right? And so like when you hit the 50 minutes, you hit the timeout and like now all your signal is gone, right? So that was one other issue that we hit. And Mac OS support, right? Most of us, I'm sure we use Linux, right? We do all of our dev and our stuff in like Golang, and we use Linux, and then we cross-compile for other platforms. But a lot of the CI systems that were out there, like, I mean, I used to be a Windows person like a long, long time ago. I don't do that anymore. I obviously have a MacBook here, but I have like a virtual machine running Linux so that I can, do all of my development. But I really don't test on both of those platforms, right? Even though I have a Mac system right here. So I kind of defer that to like, what hosted runners that the CI system provides, and kind of defer that stuff and just build the scripts and then test for them to test. And so like one of the problems we ran into is like a lot of the Mac and Windows self-hosted runners, those platforms were like paid features, and so you couldn't quite exercise them. And those that were free, there was like a 5 to 45 minute cleanup time per run between runs. So you could be sitting there for quite some time trying to get your next job to like kick off and get signal on it, right? So just kind of like a list of things here that like some problems we ran into. And so now that I've talked about problems that we ran into, I want to talk about things that I think like made us successful when we were talking about CI/CD. I have them here. Some of them are pretty obvious, like if it's easier to use, like you're probably going to use it. But kind of hinted at some, so like Mac and Windows OS support, definitely need that. If you're a Windows house, you do Microsoft, maybe you want to do the flip, right? Like I'm going to develop in Windows and then I'm going to test on the other platforms. The Linux is probably going to you're going to get that for free in the ecosystem out there. But like the Mac OS, if you're not like familiar with Mac and you're like a Windows house, maybe that's like what kind of defines like what you're going to pick. And then the other two are webhooks and self-hosted runners. So the webhooks I found was like completely instrumental in like what we were doing. And the reason why is you kind of want to be able to, you don't want to build a system from scratch. Like, I mean, you can spend all of your time doing that, but it makes a lot more sense to have to use a system where you can like hook into and like be able to like kick off and do certain things, so that you can just like add functionality or extend functionality for those CI systems. And so what we ended up doing, what we ended up doing is we ended up using GitHub Actions and for our CI system, as a platform. And we use those webhooks. They have GitHub Actions, great. They have an entire ecosystem with, I can reinvent the wheel, or I can just reuse people's other actions people have, published. And so the reason why I bring up the webhook stuff is because they had the concept of like ephemeral runners, but you can only use them for like one particular job. And so what we ended up doing was we ended up creating like a webhook functionality such that we could like keep us spontaneously create our own runners like in AWS and hook into that, but keep that runner, that self-hosted runner, alive for all of the jobs that we needed. And we use those webhooks in order to say, hey, we want to kick this off now. Hold on to that so we can take the information from one job to the next to the next. And then on the close of the job, like tear down the AWS instance. And so when we were doing like PRs and stuff like that, and we're pushing commits, like myself, like 10 commits really quick on a given PR, we just kicked off like 10 runners in AWS. And then, like that first job that got kicked off, like might not be relevant anymore because I'm already 10 commits ahead, but we just let it run anyways and let it tear down like naturally. And like what the signal that gets reported is obviously like your last run, right? So that's what I kind of found like for us, like what I consider like the essentials, like things that like propelled us to be able to like solve problems really quickly. And like, once we solved those problems, it like kind of enabled us to like tackle bigger problems and stuff like that, like concurrency for end-to-end tests and that kind of fun stuff. So this is kind of like slightly out of place, but I kind of like wanted to throw it out there because a lot of people ask like how you balance product and project, but it kind of ties into the whole CI/CD open source story, the message. So there's a lot of considerations when you're talking about, your company, your project, and then you're trying to like open source all that stuff and be an open source project, be an outstanding, upstanding like citizen in the open source community. And so there's a lot of competing interests, right? And so you got stakeholders like community, company, product managers, community managers, internal processes, user-driven features. And the question kind of I have is, do these things have to compete, right? And I think the answer is no. If you look at it and you like treat the problem in like an open source way, and kind of like what we did with the project, taking the product and moving it to a project. I'm going to use kind of like our build, like how you build our project as an example. I think what it takes is you understand all of the requirements. So you like do the assessment, like find out what the stakeholders want on the open source side, and then find out what on the product side, like what they want, write all of those things down, and then what we did, and what I would recommend everyone do, and I'm probably sure all these projects out there are doing it anyways, start with the open source side first, right? That's obviously your user facing into the community, right? Like this is what the people see when they first see your project. Start there, right? Make it as simple and as easy for a person to like build and use your project as you possibly can. So, right? And I kind of have this like two-circle thing, right? So that middle circle is kind of like your open source, your upstream kind of stuff, right? Like when we want to build our project, we use tools that everyone uses, right? All open source, right? Our project's in Go. We use like make files. I know that's a logo that probably haven't seen in a while. And then Docker containers, right? Build your project in all of the open source ways. And that gets people, cross-compile Go, create like tarballs or zip files for Windows with an install script or like however you're going to install it, so that when your user types make build, like that stuff is already ready for the user to consume and like out there, right? So you can just, hey, I got this asset, I can untar it, I can install it, and it's running. Now for the product side of things, because that's not really user facing, if you have to make that complicated, make it complicated. Because the stuff that's on the user facing side, if that stuff is complicated, like you're gonna like lower your barrier of entry for like people out there in the community. So if you need to do stuff like, as an example, we're talking about build here. If you're looking to do build, then do all of the signing stuff, like the signing keys, because you don't want to expose that in the public. Do that on the back end and sign everything, and then reattach the signed stuff for a release to the GitHub project, right? And so do all that complicated stuff downstream, like behind the firewall. And so that's kind of like an example of like how you balance product and project, at least like a template, a guide. And so like, what did I learn from all of this, right? Like, what did I learn from taking Tanzu Community Edition? It was initially Tanzu Kubernetes Grid, and then we created a Community Edition. What did I learn from taking that and moving it into open source? So yeah, I learned a lot. And kind of the key takeaways that I have are, so these are kind of like the things that I learned. So process and governance are your friend. And I know most of the time when I say process, like a lot of engineers are like, oh, no, right? Because it's like, it sounds like a hindrance, right? But when in actuality, if you like, do the open source thing, right? Which is, I'm going to have a governance doc. When we have a PR that's open, it needs to be approved by 2 people. You spell that stuff out, you put it in Markdown, you throw it in your, in your repository so everyone can see it. And like, what does that do, right? It basically said, well, one, it gives you cover, right? If like somebody says something, especially on the like product, side of things, like the internal company stuff, you point to this and you say like, this is kind of what our rules of engagement are, and like we have to do that. And it kind of gives you a way to like say, hey, like if you're going to do something that might not be kosher, you have like say like, no, this is first, right? And you can push all that other stuff aside, because it would make other people like look kind of bad if you kind of like violate that, right? So process is your friend. It provides cover for you. Automate early. It took us a considerable amount of time where we were building. Well, I was building stuff by hand, right? We had make files, you built it, but like our releases weren't automated. So I took the tarballs or the final end binaries. I ran over behind the firewall, put it through the signing thing. So like the Windows stuff were signed. We did the Mac OS signing. I manually copied the things and attached them to the release. That's very time consuming, especially if you're doing CI/CD and you're doing continuous delivery. Like you don't want to do that. As soon as we automated everything, it freed my time up to like tackle like all the end-to-end tests and like the bigger things, right? Yes, we had a release, but like, how did I know it was good, right? Like did we actually do the end-to-end testing? So once we got the build out of the way, it freed me up to like do all of the scripting and the automation to test the thing. The other thing is make technical debt like conscious decisions, right? Don't just be like, oh, like I'm just gonna kick this thing down the road because this is the easier thing to do. I would just say that if you have a problem and we were up against the release date, because marketing wanted to do this grand thing, the unveiling of this open source thing. If you have to like cut corners, like really, really, really make it a conscious decision saying, hey, and even like formalize it. Hey, we're not going to do this right now. I'm going to create a GitHub issue saying, X, Y, and Z, we can't do this because of, A, B, and C. And then that way, when someone comes back and says, hey, like what happened to this? You can like literally point to this, right? It's that transparency, that visibility in the community, not just in the community, but like also on your product side of things, right? Like we couldn't do this because of X, Y, and Z. It's like literally here in an issue, right? And then and then the other thing is like extensibility is your friend. We're all like all software engineers know, like it's easier to reuse things than to build things. And it's easier if you have something that's already out there in the community, in the ecosystem, use it and see if you can get like 80 to 90% of the way there. And then like that remaining 10 or 20%, like tweak the things you need and see if they have a way to like extend the functionality, right? And usually if it's open source, you can. Like you can, code your way through like whatever problem to tailor it to what you need. But systems that already provide those like webhooks or that extension mechanism are like, they're like really cool things that you really want to like latch yourself onto. And then kind of like the last ones are keep it simple. The easier it is like to use a system, or the easier it is for your users to use your thing, your project, keep it simple. And then like ease of use, there are like some systems that we evaluated that, like everyone's talking about these days, like what CI systems on Kubernetes are like the next big thing. But if it required for us, if it required a significant shift in mindset, it was very difficult for us to latch onto it, even though potentially it could have been like the better thing to do, right? So keep it simple and make it easy to use. And then my last closing statement here is kind of joking. Open source is first class, right? Like that is like what your goal should be. Anything that's more difficult, like difficult problems to solve, like keep that out of the community nonsense, right? Like, the stuff that might be in the community, and put that nonsense into like the downstream stuff, into like what your internal people are going to say, like marketing and product managers and all that fun stuff. Keep that like kind of on the downstream and keep it like out of the community, and always put that community first, right? And what I mean is transparency. Transparency, you need to enable the community members to be able to contribute to your project, because, that's basically, free help, right? People filing issues, people submitting PRs out in the community, and then, like enable them to like be able to enable themselves to like contribute. And then, I think that's kind of it.